Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome again to our Saturday morning radio show, the Root Cause Solution Radio Show. I am Dr. Pucci, and glad to be here with you today. So today is a very special and somber day. As you all know, it is September 11th, 2021. It is 20 years since 9/11, the attacks on the World Trade Center. And certainly many of you, I'm sure, have very strong memories of that. Certainly I do. I was actually living in New York City at that time. So I have some pretty strong emotional memories of that day, and certainly many of the months that followed that day. But essentially, I was also watching a show this morning, early today, and it was regarding it was called the DDC, which is the Department of Design and Construction in New York City, that was responsible for organizing and clearing the debris, which was a pretty remarkable process. And the word that kept coming up was resilience. Interesting, because many of you heard me speak about resilience a lot when it comes to the immune system. But it was remarkable because in 8.5 months, in only 8.5 months, they were capable of removing 150 million tons of steel and concrete debris. They worked 24/7. It was the resiliency that accomplished that. And it was just pretty remarkable and emotional. But again, resiliency. So now in our world of coronavirus, there's so much talk about the immune system. And I think there is some conflicting dialogue and language when we think about immune suppression and stuff. When we spent some other shows talking about that. But often I do speak about immune resiliency, right? The ability for your immune system to be resilient. And you know, when coronavirus first came on here a year ago, early on, I did I think it was like a 7 or 9 part series, right? I called it Immune 101. And we are actually reformulating that, editing it a little bit and reformulating that. It's as poignant today as it was then, and we will be re-releasing that, right? The Immune 101 course in its new format very shortly. So look forward to that. Look to that. Reach out to us if you need some more information about that. So we are going to kind of continue. And I'm going to answer that question. I'm just going to say we are going to continue our discussion. This month-long discussion is really revolving around our gut microbiome and the symptoms and the solutions regarding the gut. But before we get to that, right, there was a question again that we're going to address.
A couple of weeks ago, you mentioned the virus, that it penetrates through the lungs and the gut. Can you just why the gut, why the lungs?
Yeah, so good. I mean, again, this show is for you. So I don't have an agenda. I am trying to present every week, based upon the questions that you have. And so, yeah, let's just address that. So if you didn't hear, the question is, a few weeks ago, I spoke about the spike proteins and how it enters the cell and why so much the gut and the lungs and why the gut's involved with the coronavirus. I think what I want to do is I'm going to share the screen. Can I do that? Yeah, let me share the screen. Yeah, let's share the screen. All right. I'm getting pretty good at this. All right. So the first thing I want to do is to pull up, where's that picture? Right here. Boom. Okay. So that's a pretty big picture. So this is a picture. What you're seeing here real clearly is this is the image of the virus itself. Okay, on the surface of the virus are the the spike proteins in red, right? So we all have heard of the spike proteins. These are proteins. Okay, so what happens is that on the surface of certain cells in the body, and I'll show you another picture, but your lung cells, in your gut, in your blood vessels, in your kidneys, are certain receptors on that cell called ACE or ACE receptors. Okay, and the spike protein uses that receptor as its attachment point to the human cell. It's like a boat docking. It's like a lock and key, right? So these spike proteins are very specific to this receptor. And these receptors are abundant on various types of tissues. Again, I'll show you a picture, but the lungs and the gut and the kidneys and your blood vessels, okay? So they become entry points. So what happens is that the spike protein, okay, has an affinity, it locks onto the receptor, like a boat docking, and then the virus uses that as its entry point to get inside the human cell, okay? So what you're looking at here in this diagram, when we're talking about antibodies, okay? So I'm going to stay on the subject for a little bit because again, it keeps coming up, up and up and up, and people are asking about it. So I think let's just spend some time on it. Okay, I think it's worthwhile. This picture is a good picture. I've often heard an argument that how can the immune system respond or react to a virus if a virus is considered to not be living, right? So a virus is not considered to be a living entity because it does not reproduce. Like bacteria reproduce, but viruses don't reproduce, they replicate, okay? And how do they replicate, right? Well, they get inside your cell and they literally hijack your genes, right? And they use that to replicate themselves thousandfold, okay? But on the surface of the non-living virus are proteins. Now, your immune system sees proteins. Your immune system reacts to proteins. Okay, and that's good and that's bad, right? In the sense of autoimmunity, you know, your immune system may be reacting to your own body proteins, your own self proteins, like your thyroid gland, for example. Okay, but so what it really is, it's reacting to these spike proteins. Okay. So what you see here is that when we produce antibodies, okay, whether we get the infection and post-infection we recover, and now we've manufactured at some point these specific types of antibodies called IgG antibodies. Those are the antibodies that give our, like, has a memory of the antigen, or whether we've chosen to get the vaccination, and the vaccination, again, from the diagram, okay, is intended to produce antibodies that are specific to the spike protein. That's what it is. These antibodies that are being produced are antibodies that are specific in the spike protein alone. Okay, and so what happens is that when we have an accumulation of these spike proteins, okay, again, whether we've gotten them from being infected and recovered, or we're getting them from the initiation of the vaccine, right? These antibodies now accumulate. Because you have to, let me back up. You see, like when you get an infection, okay, you don't have these antibodies sitting around. These are helper cells. So you have an innate system that responds to an invading infection. This virus has a unique ability to evade that innate system, so it gets a real good jump start, right? And it takes a while before these antibodies can see it and start being manufactured and produced. So what happens is very often is that the virus itself is already getting inside a lot of cells and replicating way before the body has the capability of getting the antibodies to do anything, right? So if we can get these antibodies before we get the virus getting inside your cell, we have a jump start, right? So these antibodies that are being produced, again, specific to these specific proteins, right? So when the virus comes in, the entry point, right, is we have an abundance of antibodies that are already sitting around, and they lock onto these proteins, spike protein receptors, and they block them. They block them from attaching to these ACE or ACE receptors on your cell. That's what they're doing, right? So it mitigates, right? It lessens the ability for the virus to get inside your cell. That's what we want. Now, the argument, whether you're going to do that naturally through getting the infection and recovering from the infection versus getting the vaccination to accomplish this, right? Now, I don't have a diagram here, but I'm going to repeat this again, okay? But again, we talk about risks and rewards. So these antibodies, are being produced or manufactured in very specific immune cells called plasma cells. They're abundant in your lymph nodes, okay? That's why you see your lymph nodes kind of get swollen when you get sick, right? Your immune system is active in making antibodies against the antigen, the bacteria, whatever, right? So these plasma cells are manufacturing these antibodies. So what's in the peer-reviewed journals, what a lot of the studies are showing us at this point is that there is a difference in the location of these antibody production in the plasma cells from getting the infection versus getting the vaccine. That's a distinct difference, right? So when plasma cells have inside of it called a germinal center. The image I use with people is an egg and the yolk. The yolk is let's call it the germinal center, and that's where antibodies are normally produced. But what seems to happen is that when we get the infection and the immune system and these plasma cells start to manufacture these antibodies, the antibodies are not being manufactured in the yolk or the germinal center. They're being manufactured in the white part of the egg, the albumin, right? Let's just call it that, outside the germinal center. So they're still producing the antibodies, but they're not producing them in the same way that it normally occurs. It seems that they are being activated in this part outside the germinal center. What does that mean is that it seems that these antibodies that are being manufactured by being infected outside the germinal center have more capability of cross-reacting with your own body self-tissue, right? Meaning that your immune system makes these antibodies and they become a little bit non-specific and they can turn on or trigger autoimmunity. So there seems to be, right, that many people who get the infection when these antibodies are being manufactured, they're also cross-reacting with self-tissues, whether it be blood vessels, thyroid, liver, it doesn't make a difference, right? And that's why you're seeing an increase, what we call an explosion of autoimmunity post-COVID infection. In contrast, right, it seems to be that the research so far is that the antibodies that are being manufactured, that are being initiated by the messenger RNA vaccination, these antibodies are being manufactured in the yolk or in the germinal center. That is a very strong distinction. And so these antibodies are being produced in the germinal center, again, which is making antibodies against these spike proteins. They seem to be more specific and less cross-reactive with self-tissue. So a little bit more protection against the development of autoimmunity. I hope that is a strong distinction. Okay, now going back to the original question itself about the entry point, about the lungs and the gut. Okay, so if you look at the image, right, you're seeing these receptors, and we're going to call these ACE receptors on cells that these spike proteins attach to. So what antibodies are trying to block that. So in this picture, okay, it's just a kind of a black and white picture. It comes from an article that we were reading, COVID-19 and cardiovascular disease, thrombosis, strokes, angiotensin receptors, which is the ACE receptors. And the diagram is just showing you how many of these receptors, these ACE receptors, high abundance are in your lungs, especially in the deep part of your lungs called the alveoli, right? So as the virus it attaches to those ACE receptors and it seems to infiltrate those lung cells pretty quickly, right? So it's going to begin to create damage to the lung cells pretty quickly. But there's also a high abundance of these ACE receptors in the digestive tract, right? So the digestive tract becomes an entry point to this, right? There's a lot of these ACE receptors also in the cardiovascular system, in the endothelial wall, right? And we also have these ACE receptors in your kidneys and your liver, okay? But the high density, I guess you might say, is in the lungs and in the gut, but also the blood vessels, the kidneys, and the liver, and also in men in the testes. It's shown down here. As strange as that sounds, okay? So here's the ACE or ACE2 receptors is expressed on lungs, gut, kidney, epithelial cells, cardiac muscles, heart, endothelial cells, and in the testes, and to a lesser extent in the breast and skin and other organs. So they're everywhere. But again, the lung and gut, high density, followed by the kidneys, heart, and the liver, basically. Okay. Is there anything else I can answer on that, you think?
No, I think you're, I had a, no, we're good.
Yeah, and just one more thing on that, just because just to help people a little bit with the idea of blood pressure and all that stuff, because what these these receptors are for an enzyme, right? Which is what the ACE2 is called the Angiotensin II enzyme, and what happens is that right, you have angiotensin I is called an angiotensin II. So your blood vessels, contract and relax and contract, relax, and that helps to regulate blood pressure, right? We need a certain amount of blood pressure, right, to get oxygen and nutrients up against gravity to our brains, right? We got to move it around against gravity. So we need pressure to do that. This is why if people have low blood pressure, that's not a good thing, right? Low blood pressures, we can't get oxygen to the brain. We can't get nutrients and minerals to our cells in our brain and elsewhere, right? And that's not a good, healthy thing. Like an issue like people sometimes they stand up quickly and they get lightheaded, right? Because you can't get the pressure, get oxygen to the brain, and we get lightheaded. Versus the constriction and tightness of blood vessels, which is high blood pressure. In the same fashion, if the blood pressure, if your vessels are really, really tight, right, you're putting a lot of pressure against those artery walls, which is damaging the artery walls in an attempt, and it's a struggle to get the oxygen to the brain. So both scenarios are not really good, right? But this delicate kind of constriction and relaxation of your blood vessels, right, is regulated by this system called the angiotensin system. So the angiotensin I stimulates the angiotensin II, which is to create tension and tightness, to increase pressure. And it's the AC2, the angiotensin II, that enzyme that then causes that constriction to relax. Let me repeat that, a little confusing, right? So the AC2, what we're talking about with coronavirus, is the activation of these receptors turns on the enzyme that relaxes your blood vessels. That's a good thing. We want that, right? But if the coronavirus is hijacking that, right, then you don't get activation of that enzyme. The coronavirus interferes with the activation of that enzyme, and then therefore the inactivation means that you cannot relax your blood vessels, and so it's going to cause your blood pressure to go up. So the very nature of getting the infection is going to cause your blood pressure to go up. This is why so many people develop headaches, right, and hypertension, right? But imagine if a person already has high blood pressure, and then they get this on top of that. That's not a good thing, right? This is the reason why people have hypertension and cardiovascular problems, right? When people have diabetes, it tends to also cause cardiovascular issues and hypertensive states. Right. Now, we're not even talking about genetics here. We're just talking about just the physiology of our lifestyle choices. Again, so blood pressure and type 2 diabetes, right? These things, many of these things certainly can be regulated. And much of what we do in our work is to campaign help people, right? But many of these things are lifestyle induced, which is one of the reasons why you think about what goes on in our country and why the United States has the highest gross amount of people infected with coronavirus. It just kind of, again, points into our whole healthcare system, in my opinion, about, that the healthcare system, if you want to call it that, I always refer to it as a sick care system, how it is really failing people, right? Because really the turnaround, the pivot point here, the new paradigm shift, right, is that how do we really get people educated and motivated and encouraged to start taking responsibility, to start making lifestyle choices, to even work with our genes, to make our genes work more effectively for us so that we can begin to lower these comorbidities, right? It's just that, the United States of America has the highest percentage of obesity in the world. And that's why we have higher percentages of, not just because of obesity, but we have probably the highest percentages of type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular risk and hypertension, right? I don't know, you can't quote me, but I think maybe blood pressure medication, maybe outside of statin drugs, but blood pressure medications may be the most prescribed medication. Okay, so, okay, I know we talk a lot about that, and I kind of get sideways, but I mean, again, these questions come up a lot, and so this show is really designed to answer your questions, and I hope that is, and if this inspires you to ask more questions relative to this, just reach out. Just reach out. It's interesting because every time I'm sitting down and reviewing lab tests with patients, I mean, somehow their questions come back around to, the coronavirus and what do they do for their kids and help their kids and stuff like that, right? But when you look at a lot of these functional lab tests that we do, the purpose of these lab tests is not to, they're proactive tests, right? These lab tests are not designed to diagnose diseases. Not in the slightest. These lab tests are empowering tests. They're designed to show us where we can take actionable steps, okay, both from lifestyle and dietary standpoints and nutraceutical standpoints, even looking at our genes and other things that we can do to kind of redirect our ships and put us into a more empowering position to take the reins back and kind of control our destiny a little bit when it comes to our health and our longevity, right? We just don't want to age. We want to age well, right? And how do we become more resilient to not just this virus and the variants of this virus, but the other viruses that are going to come along and other immune challenges that we have in this toxic world. So fear not, just take, be proactive. And the whole design of what we do in functional medicine is to help all of you, to myself included, and people that are important in my life, to take positive action and do those things. So let's just go back to, let me close this out. Okay, let's close this out. Back face to face. And let's just, with the time we have remaining, and we're going to go over a little bit. That's okay. We'll go over a few minutes here. We don't have to be held to 30 minutes. I'm not going to make it an hour, but we'll try to do the best we can. So we were trying to follow up on the theme of last week, which is we're on this month talking about the gut thing. And it is so interesting that so many people that we are seeing and reaching out to us today, recently, I mean, gastric distress is a huge complaint. I don't want to say it's a complaint. I mean, it's really a presenting issue, but it's quite it's disruptive. It's quite a significant challenge in people's quality of life. It's not like they're just saying, I got a little cramp today. I mean, this thing is, it's really compromising the quality of people's life day in and day out, week in and week out, month in and month out. Okay. Sure, but
Like somebody can't even swallow.
well, yeah, I mean, people who are listening, know this. I mean, it's like, it's like people just, the bloat, the distension, the pain, the cramping, the constipation, the diarrhea, the irritable bowel syndromes. I mean, getting to the point where, I mean, everything that people eat seem to trigger a response. And so they are like now in anxiety mode because they're anxious about the foods they eat, and then they don't eat because they're trying to get relief from the pain, but then they're losing weight, and then they're concerned about losing weight, and so they're anxious about that, and then also anxious about what I can eat and can't eat. I mean, I get it. So there is this whole, conundrum. So it's not like it's just gut, right? It's all the emotional components around the gut. Now, I want to talk. Yeah, which is why kind of today's subject matter a little bit I wanted to talk to you about is the we want to talk about really is the gut-brain axis. And so if anyone is who's actually spoken with me, they know that I often will try to emphasize, right, is that when we have gut issues, we have gut complaints, right, we typically are going to go see a gastroenterologist. If you go see your primary is just going to refer you to the gastroenterologist. And there is a role for that, right? Because, they're going to, examine you and probably encourage a person under those circumstances to do what? An endoscopy coming from one end, or a colonoscopy from the other end, right? Or maybe even in some points do a biopsy to check for celiac disease. And in last week's episode, right, we talked a lot about the diagnosis of SIBO, right? small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. I don't want to, go back there, but again, the testing for that, right, is either a biopsy, which is the gold standard, which is very invasive and very costly, and still what's the treatment protocol with SIBO? It's antibiotic use, which never gets to the underlying root cause of the problem, right? You just knock off some bacteria and 2 months later, you're back to square one again, and usually worse off because of it. But that's all they have in their toolbox. The other testing is the breath test, which I explained to you last week is really a very poor test, right? It's so inconclusive and too many false positives. So SIBO is very real, but it is overly diagnosed, right? And even if it is the case, what I'm trying to lead into is why. Again, root cause is why does a person develop SIBO? So in your gastrointestinal model, right, is they're looking at a person strictly at the gut and trying to just treat the gut through antibiotic therapy. So if you go into natural healthcare, we all do it, right? You can talk to functional doctors or integrative doctors, or as you as a consumer, go to the internet and Google stuff, right? You're Googling gut stuff. And what is the treatment going to be, right? You're going to try some dietary changes, and you're going to try a whole smorgasbord of probiotics, right? Hoping that those probiotics are going to be the answer, right? And very often people are doing these things and they are still confounded, right? And they hear things, well, if you got SIBO, don't take the probiotics and take the probiotics and do the low fat MAP diet and all these different things. And you're like spinning and you're going crazy. And I hear. So I'm trying to present today, and I haven't gotten to it yet, right? But it's called a gut-brain axis. Now, again, I have a background in functional neurology, so this has been on my plate for 15 years, right? But I never look at a person who has gut problems and only look at their gut. You have to look at them from a brain down perspective. You have to look at a person neurologically, right? So my point I wanted to get today, we have few more weeks to even go deeper into this, right? But in my world, right, there's a language we call it it's referred to as north to south approach to a gut issue. So your gut, if I can kind of use this analogy, is pretty far south from your brain. So there's a lot of, you got to give your brain, it's going to go all the way down, right? So what we wanted to talk today about with the gut-brain axis, right, is something known as your sympathetic and your parasympathetic nervous system. That's what we'll just kind of focus on today a little bit. Many of you have heard of that. Many of you maybe not have heard of that. So let me just put it in so everybody's on the same page. Right? Your brain is an organ that really is the master organ, right? We can all agree that your brain controls everything, right? So your brain, your nervous system, extension of your brain, kind of a two-way street. So you have your sensory system, which is one way of information going to your brain. So when you feel discomfort or pain in your gut, that's a sensory input traveling up the nervous system into areas of your brain where your brain can perceive that. And your experience of pain is in your brain, right? Sensory is one way in. Motor is movement. Me speaking right now is motor, right? Moving your arms, just movement. And that starts in your brain and it's one way out. So sensory is one way directionally up to the brain, and motor is one way out from the brain. But then you have your automatic, or what is called autonomous nervous system. And that's really what runs the show. That's working on everything behind the scenes, everything that is working automatically. And that's a lot, right? You're not thinking about how to get your kidneys to detoxify things 24/7. It's working behind the scenes, right? So everything works automatically. Or how your heart beats, even breathing for that example, right? But everything that goes on behind the scenes, right, all the biochemical processes are controlled and regulated by what is referred to as your automatic or autonomous nervous system. And that system is divided into two divisions. So one is known as your sympathetic division. And your sympathetic division is what drives your, what is called your fight or flight response. And what that means simply is your survival response. The other division is known as your parasympathetic. And your parasympathetic division, okay, is what is referred to as nurturing and for growth. Okay, so you have survival and you have nurturing and you have growth. Okay, those are the two divisions. So basically is your entire inner organ system, was known as visceral, right, is innervated predominantly with your parasympathetic nerve chain, right? It is, so your gut specifically is parasympathetic. This is why when we eat food, we're digesting food, right? Our nervous system should be, right, parasympathetic dominant. And that way it brings blood into the gut so that we can digest food and absorb its nutrients. And our gut should be in a relaxed state in order to do that, right? But your sympathetic nervous system is your fight or flight or your survival mechanism. I know it's a silly analogy, but I always say to people, what is more important, surviving or reproducing, right? And it's surviving. You can't reproduce if you're dead, right? So the survival mechanisms override growth and nurturing, right? You can't have them both going on simultaneously. And since today is the anniversary of 9/11, it's an easy analogy too, because many of you may remember, some don't, but prior to 9/11, right, the economy was really booming. But where was our defense? It was low and we were vulnerable to an attack. Then what happened immediately after 9/11 is our defense system, right? Port authorities, everything. Now you take your shoes up at the airport. Our defense went screaming through the roof. And what happened to the economy? The growth bottomed out. That's the yin yang and seesaw act, right? Now you bring it back into healthcare. So when you need sympathetic, we need protection and growth, right? But we want like a nice, even kind of a balance to this thing. And so what we're seeing, maybe even since 9/11 and now coronavirus and just life in general, is that, everything is hyper, we're just in a world that we live in sympathetic dominance. I mean, there's just no ifs, ands, or buts about it. We live in a sympathetic dominant world. And just even the fact that we have access to social media and access to information 24/7 and we're on our cell phones, is we're getting stuff coming at us that's really hard to process. And so what happens is our bodies go into a defense posture and we activate our sympathetic nerve chain. So we're in a fight or flight response so much and so often and so long that it kind of gets stuck there. So when we are in a sympathetic dominance, and his blood is pulled away from the gut, right, and other organs, it's actually even pulled away from the frontal lobes of your brain and shunted back to the limbic system of your brain, because your limbic system of your brain is your survival area of your brain. Okay, right? The primordial emotion in your limbic system is fear. Because fear is survival. You're supposed to fear, and my example is the saber-toothed tiger. If you don't fear it, you'll do something silly like stick around and you'll probably get eaten. So fear is a defense posture. But if we're pulling blood away from our frontal lobes and we're shunting it back to the limbic system and we're doing it over and over and over again, it gets really kind of hardwired, right? That limbic system's kind of running out of control and we're living in a fear state, and that promotes anxiety, right? But all the blood is being pulled out of the gut simultaneously, right? Because it's got to go to the muscles so you can run and fight, run away from the beast or fight something, right? But if that's going on and going on and going on and going on, right? Now your gut can't function properly. You're trying to put food into your gut and your gut is rejecting it. It's like, no, 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 no. We're not supposed to be eating. We got to run and find something. And your musculoskeletal system is in a constant state of tension, right? Short term, okay. But imagine if like 24/7, you're in a constant state of musculoskeletal tension. Is your musculoskeletal system can't sustain that, and it starts breaking down. And what do? We complain about chronic back pain and chronic neck pain and chronic shoulder pain and muscle pain, right? And we're seeking all these various treatments and modalities, including chiropractic and physical therapy and all these different things, right? And not really getting much resolvement. Why? Is because neurologically we're in a defense posture, right? So again, what do? You can't just, as a provider, you just can't consider gastric or abdominal distension and bloat and food just as a gastric thing, right? So your doctor, your gastroenterologist, 9 out of 10 times is ruling out pathology, which is a good thing. So the scopes rule out, God forbid, cancer, right, and other things, right? But you're often left with terms like gastritis and IBS and SIBO and all these different things, right? And then you're trying to approach it singularly with the treatments of either antibiotics or probiotics and or combinations of these things, and often left disappointed in the end of it all, right? And again, and then the anxiety and moods and things are getting worse, right? So, if a person sees me and their complaint is anxiety, right, I still analyze the health of their gut relative to the anxiety. But if the person's coming with a gut problem, I still have to analyze the relationship of their brain and their nervous system and how it's functioning to their gut problems. And oftentimes you have to do combinations of things, right? So it's not that the probiotics are not helpful, right? But how do you rebalance the sympathetic and the parasympathetic? How do you do that? Okay, so maybe we should leave it there, or should we go on a little bit? Because there's other things I can go on a little bit further because, right? I'll leave you one more thing, because many people I think have heard and are going to ask about the vagal nerve, V-A-G-A-L. Your vagal nerve begins in your brainstem. It begins in your brainstem. Okay. It's interesting. So your vagal nerve, it begins in your brainstem, and your vagal nerve is your predominant parasympathetic nerve. Okay, and that's what meanders down. It's called the wandering nerve. It meanders down. It actually splits, and it innervates every organ in our bodies, but predominantly the gut. So that's your vagal nerve to your gut. Okay, and it's interesting because as recently as just a few years ago, new evidence has come about in the scientific world saying that they now know where Parkinson's disease begins. So Parkinson's disease, right, is a neurological, progressive, degenerative disease. It's a degenerative disease of our brains. But they now have quite good evidence that Parkinson's disease begins in your gut. Boom. Right. So again, gut to brain access, right? I think I've mentioned in previous episodes, there's a whole new model of depression, thankfully. So finally, and even in the psychiatric world, it's in the psychiatric journals, right? They're starting to look at depression not as only as a chemical imbalance, meaning that we're going to give you a chemical drug, an antidepressant, to manipulate your brain chemicals and blame it on your genes. Finally, there is a new model of depression, which is known as the model of inflammation. Okay, inflammation, meaning that the depression really is a symptom, caused by inflammation. And where is this inflammation coming from? Very often it's coming from the gut. Okay, other places too, maybe we'll get into that, right? But it's kind of a new model, which, is really kind of exciting and powerful, because now, if we start understanding the mechanisms behind inflammation and what's really driving inflammation and make some adjustments and changes to calm that down, we can now start to change and impact and kind of, calm down the depression, okay, without the drugs. Okay, so let's leave it there. I know I can go on for 3 hours, right? But yay, I think it's good stuff. I hope it's good stuff. I hope you find it fascinating, interesting. Again, give us your questions. This is for you. And again, we will be, if you know other people that might be interested in our what we're promoting, what we're speaking about here, get them to join our Facebook group, right? And we have our webinar coming up at the end of September. So people that you care about, just that you think that are interested in this, sign them up, right? Our drive here, our goal is to reach more and more people, to help more and more people. It's just, we all kind of want to, I do, at least I kind of envision a world where people can kind of get along and be happy, right? We all will benefit from that. And you have to be healthy and feel good though, right? So that's the one way we can contribute. Okay, thanks everybody. We'll see you next time.